In the year 220 AD, in a ceremony held at the court of Zhou, the last Han emperor stepped down from the throne, read a prepared abdication edict, and handed over the imperial seal. He was not deposed by force. He was not killed. He was given the title Duke of Shenyang, allowed to keep his Han ritual customs, permitted to use the Han calendar in his personal household, and sent to a comfortable estate in the country. He lived there for 14 more years, quietly performing ancestral rites to the dynasty he had surrendered. The man who received the seal was Cao Pi, son of the great General Cao Cao, who had died that same year. Cao Pi declared himself the first emperor of the Wei dynasty. Within a year, 2 other kingdoms would declare themselves sovereign: Shu Han in the southwest, Wu in the southeast. The 3 kingdoms period had formally begun. 4 centuries of Han rule had ended in a ceremony, a legal transfer, a document, and a pension. This makes it difficult to describe as a catastrophe. There was no sack of a capital, no burning of the palaces, no foreign army at the gates. And yet the world after 220 AD was profoundly different from the world before it. A dynasty that had given the Chinese people their name, Han people, Han script, Han civilization, was gone. The institutions it had built over 400 years would take another 60 years of warfare to reconstitute in the Jin dynasty, and never quite reconstitute in the same form again. Something genuine had ended. The question is how. The answer requires going back not just to 184 AD, when the Yellow Turban Rebellion shook the dynasty to its foundations, but to the way the Eastern Han state was constructed from the start, to the compromises Liu Xiu made when he restored the dynasty in 25 AD, and to a structural political trap that ground down the Han's governing capacity for more than a century before anyone lit a single yellow lantern. The Han Dynasty that Emperor Geazi founded in 206 BC was one of the great political achievements of the ancient world. Liu Bang, the man who became Geazi, was not an aristocrat. He was a minor village official from the peasant class who had risen through the chaos following the Qin dynasty's collapse, eventually defeating his more aristocratic rival Xiang Yu at the Battle of Gaixia. His victory was won partly through military skill, partly through political intelligence, and partly through a talent for binding talented people to him that his rival Xiang Yu conspicuously lacked. The dynasty he founded inherited the Qin administrative system, the prefecture and county structure, the standardized script, the unified weights and measures, while discarding the Qin's hated severity. Where the Qin had ruled by law and terror, the early Han governed with a lighter hand, reducing taxes, releasing conscripts, letting the countryside recover. The scholar Jia Yi wrote that the Qin had lost power through severity, and that the Han should rule through benevolence. The Han court largely agreed, at least in the early years. The great emperor who defined what the Han would become was Wu, Emperor Wu Wudi, who reigned for 54 years, from 141 to 87 BC. Under Wu, the Han expanded to a scale that dwarfed its predecessors. His generals pushed the Xiongnu nomads off the Ordos Plateau and deep into Central Asia. Han armies reached the Korean peninsula in the northeast, Vietnam in the south, and the edge of the Tarim Basin in the northwest. The diplomat Zhang Qian traveled west of the Pamir Mountains and returned with knowledge of Central Asian kingdoms, opening the network of trade routes that later generations would call the Silk Road. But Emperor Wu's most lasting innovation was not military. It was institutional. He formalized the system of selecting officials through Confucian education and imperial examination. The idea that the state should be governed by men selected for literary and moral cultivation, rather than simply by hereditary nobility. The Imperial Academy, the Taixu, trained hundreds of scholars in the Confucian classics. Those scholars then competed for positions in the vast administrative apparatus that stretched from the capital at Chang'an down through the provinces, prefectures, and counties of the empire. This was a genuinely revolutionary idea. It did not create perfect meritocracy. Family connections still mattered enormously, and the examination was accessible mainly to those who could afford years of education. But it created a bureaucratic class with a shared ethical framework, a common literary culture, and a shared language of governance that could function across enormous distances and diverse local conditions. When later historians wrote that Han rule gave China its identity, they meant partly this: a class of scholar officials trained to think of themselves as servants of the realm, guardians of the Confucian moral order, obligated to remonstrate with their superiors, and to protect the people from arbitrary power. The examination system, the bureaucracy, the legal codes, the Silk Road trade. These were the achievements that made the Han the dynasty that defined China. They were also the achievements that made the Han's eventual fragmentation so difficult to explain. How does an institution this sophisticated, this deeply embedded in the social structure, collapse not from external attack but from within? To understand that question, it helps to notice that the Han actually did fail once, and was then deliberately put back together before the final collapse came. When Wang Mang seized the throne in 9 AD, declaring the Xin dynasty over the ruins of the Western Han's succession crisis, he was not simply a usurper in the ordinary sense. He was a man with a genuine political theory. Wang Mang was an imperial-in-law who had served as regent for a series of child emperors, and what he saw from that vantage point was a dynasty that had lost its moral compass. Great families accumulating land at the peasants' expense, a market in government offices, a state that collected taxes from the poor while the rich were effectively exempt. Wang Mang believed that the cure was a return to the ideal model of the ancient Zhou dynasty: redistribution of land, abolition of private slavery, monetary reform, regulation of grain prices. His diagnosis was not wrong. His implementation was catastrophic. The bureaucracy that was supposed to carry out land redistribution lacked the local knowledge, the legal mechanisms, and the physical coercive capacity to transfer tens of millions of acres against the resistance of families that had held that land for generations and had their own armed retainers. The currency reforms produced chaos rather than stability. The abolition of slavery was announced but could not be enforced. Where reform did reach, it produced resentment rather than gratitude from those it nominally benefited, because the new arrangements were often worse administered than the old ones. Then the Yellow River shifted its course, catastrophically and permanently, in 11 AD. The river, which had previously reached the sea south of the Shandong Peninsula, broke northward through new channels, flooding millions of acres of farmland and displacing millions of people. The flooding was not Wang Mang's fault, but a government already struggling with the contradictions of its own reform program was in no position to manage a natural disaster of that scale. Famine followed the flood. Peasant uprisings followed the famine. The Red Eyebrow Rebellion and the Lu Lin Rebellion swept the north. Wang Mang was killed when rebels stormed his palace in Chang'an in 23 AD. What the Wang Mang interregnum tells us is not simply that the Western Han failed. It tells us that the failure was recognized, diagnosed, and that a serious reform program was attempted, and that the structural forces opposing reform were too powerful to overcome even with imperial authority behind the attempt. When Liu Ziu restored the Han in 25 AD, moving the capital to Luoyang, he was restoring the dynasty with full knowledge of this history. He was also, inevitably, restoring it on terms that the great families who had supported his military campaign could accept. The land question was set aside. The structural problem that had driven Wang Mang's failed revolution persisted. The answer begins with land. From the time Emperor Guangwu re-established the dynasty in 25 AD, the Eastern Han was caught in an agricultural paradox. The peasant smallholder was the foundation of the state, the person who paid taxes, provided labor levies, and served in the army when conscripted. The peasant's continued independence was essential to the revenue system, but the forces pushing the peasant toward tenancy or debt bondage were structural and powerful. The great landowning families, the Heijia, the powerful households, had survived the Xin dynasty interregnum, the civil wars, and the restoration because they had land, walls, stored grain, and private armies. They had backed Liu Ziu's restoration. They expected to be rewarded. Liu Ziu could not and did not strip them of their accumulated estates. He needed them too much. Their private landholdings, which paid reduced or no tax under various legal arrangements, expanded generation by generation. When a peasant family had a bad harvest, and in the Yellow River Basin, droughts and floods were regular events, they borrowed from their neighbors or their local great family. Interest rates were high. Defaults were common. A family that defaulted on a loan might survive as tenant farmers on the same land they had once owned, working for a share of the harvest and still legally obligated for taxes to the state as well. Over generations, this process, operating quietly, one defaulted loan at a time, concentrated land in fewer and fewer hands, reduced the free peasant class, and shrank the tax base the hand state depended on to pay its army and its bureaucracy. This erosion was invisible from the capital. The census figures were unreliable. The great families underreported their tenants because tenants attached to their households paid no state tax. By the 2nd century AD, the hand census was counting far fewer taxable households than there were actual people. The state's notional revenue was not its actual revenue. The gap was filled partly by debasing coinage, partly by selling offices, partly by reducing services. None of these fixes addressed the underlying problem, and each made it slightly worse. Set against this slow agricultural hemorrhage was a political cycle that is almost mechanical in its regularity. The Eastern Han emperors died young. Emperor He died at 26. Emperor Shang died at 3 months. Emperor An died at 32. Emperor Shun died at 30. Emperor Chong died at 3. Emperor Zhai was poisoned at 8. Emperor Huan died at 36. The median age at death for Eastern Han emperors is startlingly low. Whether this reflects genuine early mortality, the physical toll of excess, or something about the court environment is unclear, but the effect is clear. A dynasty in which emperors repeatedly die young is a dynasty governed intermittently by regents. When an emperor died without a competent adult male heir, which happened repeatedly in the Eastern Han, the Empress Dowager, his mother or senior widow, selected the next emperor from the pool of imperial relatives. She then governed as regent. She brought her own family into the key positions: the great general, the senior minister, the palace commander. The Empress Dowager's family, the Wagia, the external relatives, ran the government. They distributed offices, commanded armies, made decisions. They were, in effect, the state. The young emperor grew up watching this. He understood that when he reached maturity and sought to govern himself, the Wagia would resist. They had built careers and networks over years of his minority. They were not going to hand power back simply because the boy was now a man. The emperor's only reliable allies were the people who had been with him inside the palace from childhood. The palace eunuchs, the men who had groomed him, educated him, guarded his bedchamber, and been his personal attendants since infancy. The eunuchs had no family connections, no estates, no private armies. Their power depended entirely on the emperor's favor. They were loyal in the way that only people with no alternative patron can be loyal. When an emperor moved against the Wagia, he used the eunuchs as his operatives. The plot was typically swift, a night when the family's leaders were summoned, arrested, and executed before their supporters could organize a response. The eunuchs were rewarded with titles, fiefs, and access to official appointments for their relatives. And now the eunuchs were powerful. And now there was a new empress, who would one day be a new Empress Dowager, who would bring her new family into power, who would in time need to be broken by a new emperor using new eunuchs. Each revolution of this cycle left the institution weaker. Capable Confucian officials, the men trained in the examination system, who believed in the moral framework of scholar governance, watched this process with increasing horror. They petitioned, they remonstrated, they wrote letters. A eunuch had no legitimate Confucian role in governance. The eunuch's power was the negation of the scholar official system. Every time a Wagia was broken by eunuchs, and the eunuchs were then rewarded with titles and influence, the ideal of the Confucian meritocratic state was degraded a little further. The Confucian scholars and the eunuchs became enemies. This was not simply a factional struggle. It was a conflict about what kind of state the Han was supposed to be. The scholars saw the eunuchs as the corruption of the moral order. The eunuchs saw the scholars as the moralistic agents of the next Wagia. Neither was entirely wrong. The crisis came to a head in 166 AD under Emperor Huan, when the court eunuchs, now powerful enough to act independently, accused the leading Confucian officials of forming a party against the emperor and demanded their punishment. Hundreds of scholar officials were arrested, banned from office permanently, or executed in what became known as the partisan prohibition. The scholars who escaped punishment were disgraced by association. The second wave, in 169 AD, was worse. Over 100 officials were killed. Hundreds more were banned from government service for life. The partisan prohibitions did not simply remove specific individuals. They destroyed the institutional culture that had given the Han its governing capacity. The men who remained in office after 169 AD knew that principle was dangerous. Compliance was safer. The eunuch-scholar conflict had gutted the Han's self-correcting mechanism, and the timing was catastrophic because the 170s and 180s brought a sustained period of natural disaster across the heartland. The North China Plain, the great agricultural core of the Han state, the Yellow River Basin, the densely settled provinces of Jizhu, Jingzhou, Yanzhou, was struck by repeated droughts, floods, and locust plagues across the decade between 175 and 184 AD. These were not isolated events. The climate record for this period shows a sustained pattern of agricultural instability. Grain stores, already drawn down by a century of structural impoverishment, could not absorb the shocks. Famine spread. Families who had survived as tenant farmers found themselves without even the share of harvest that had kept them alive. Into this situation walked Zhang Jiu. Zhang Jiu was a healer and teacher who claimed to practice Taoist medicine. He had been traveling the countryside for roughly a decade, healing the sick, apparently through genuinely effective herbal and hygienic practices, and preaching a doctrine he called the Way of Supreme Peace. The philosophical foundation of the Way came from a text called the Taiping Jing, which promised that correct spiritual practice would bring about the age of supreme peace, a time when the old, corrupt order would be swept away and the world would be remade in harmony and justice. Zhang Jiu and his two brothers organized their followers into a hierarchical network of 36 administrative divisions, each called a fang, covering the major provinces of the north and east. The organization was sophisticated. It was religious, but it was also a census, a supply network, a chain of command, and a communications system. At its peak, the movement is said to have had nearly 400,000 followers, though this figure is certainly a round estimate. The actual number may have been larger. The theological claim Zhang Jiu made was specific and calendrical. The year 184 AD, which corresponded to the first year of the Jiazi cycle in the traditional Chinese calendar, was supposed to be the year when the blue heaven of Han would be replaced by the yellow heaven of the new order. Yellow was the color of earth, the element that succeeded the Han's blue in the traditional five-phase succession theory. The uprising was not simply a peasant revolt. It was a millenarian event, a prophecy being fulfilled, a moment when the suffering of the previous generation could finally be explained as the necessary darkness before the dawn of a new age. The rebellion began on the 15th day of the second month of 184 AD, simultaneously across 8 provinces. Followers wore yellow turbans and cloth headbands as their identifying marks. The speed of the coordination was remarkable. The Han government had been warned. A follower of Zhang Jiu had informed on the plot to officials in the capital, but the warning came too late for effective prevention, and the court's first response was the execution of the informer's associates rather than rapid military mobilization. There is something important to understand about who the Yellow Turbans were. They were not primarily bandits or desperate criminals making a tactical calculation. They were believers. Zhang Jiu had built his movement not through coercion, but through years of healing ministry, traveling the provinces, treating the sick, organizing communal gatherings, building a network of faith communities in which shared suffering was given a spiritual meaning. The peasants who tied yellow cloth around their heads in 184 AD were people who believed genuinely that the old world was ending and that the new one was beginning. They were responding to theology, to hope, to a promise that their years of dispossession and famine were not senseless. that they were the darkness before a necessary dawn. This matters for understanding the suppression. Han military force could break the Yellow Turbans as an army. It could not break them as a movement of the spirit. After 185 AD, Yellow Turban remnants continued to operate in the countryside for years. Local communities that had organized under Zhang Ju's structure maintained their networks after the military uprising was crushed. In Hanzhong, in the west, a parallel movement called the Five Pecks of Rice, led by the Zhangling family, who combined Taoist practice with local governance, established what was effectively a semi-autonomous religious state that persisted for decades. The Yellow Turban Rebellion failed militarily, but the spiritual and social grievances that produced it did not disappear. They went underground, resurfaced in different forms, and contributed to the continued instability of the countryside that made the Eastern Han ungovernable even after the main rebellion was crushed. The Yellow Turban army swept through the countryside. They attacked county seats, burned tax offices, seized grain stores, and liberated prisoners. The Han's county-level military forces were not prepared for an uprising at this scale. Prefectural troops were overwhelmed. The court sent imperial armies under experienced commanders, Huangfu Song, Zhu Jun, Lu Zhai, and they were competent officers who eventually suppressed the main uprisings. Zhang Ju died in the field in the autumn of 184 AD. His brothers died shortly after. The three main commanders of the Yellow Turban movement were gone within a single season. But the suppression of the Yellow Turbans came at a price that the Han could not afford. The court's decision to suppress the rebellion had required empowering regional commanders in ways that had never been done before. Provincial governors, who had previously been civil officials with limited independent military authority, were granted the power to raise their own armies, collect their own taxes, and make their own appointments. The court needed soldiers fast, and the only way to get them fast was to let men with local resources, local networks, and local reputations raise them. The theory was that the authority would be returned when the emergency was over. It was not returned. It could not be returned. A man who has raised an army, fed it from taxes he has collected, appointed officers who are loyal to him personally, and governed a territory for years does not give that up because a court that cannot enforce its own demands requests it. The devolution of military authority was permanent. What it created was not exactly warlordism in the classic sense. These men still operated within the formal structure of Han titles and Han legitimacy, but it was the institutional precondition for warlordism. The army was no longer the state's army. It was the general's army. The man who demonstrated most clearly what this meant was Dong Zhuo. Dong Zhuo was a frontier general from the northwest. He had spent his career on the western border, fighting the Qiang people and the Xianbei nomads. He was physically imposing, personally brave, politically crude, and morally unconstrained. When the court summons came in 189 AD, he was already at the head of a substantial frontier army. The crisis that triggered the summons was the final confrontation between the Empress Dowager He and the palace eunuchs, the eternal cycle playing out one last time, with lethal results for everyone involved. He Jin, the Empress Dowager's powerful brother, had decided that the eunuchs needed to be eliminated permanently. He sent out summons to frontier commanders, including Dong Zhuo, to march on the capital and back his play with military force. The plan leaked. The eunuchs acted first, assassinated He Jin before the armies arrived, and then found themselves surrounded by He Jin's men who slaughtered every eunuch they could find, over 2,000 killed in the palace. The ancient power struggle ended not in a coup but in a massacre. The bodies were piled in the palace corridors. Dong Zhuo arrived at the capital to find the power vacuum that massacre had created. He assessed the situation with the cold practicality of a frontier soldier. There was no organized force capable of opposing him. He deposed the teenage emperor, installed a 9-year-old in his place, and declared himself acting regent of the Han. He executed rivals, including the young officer who would grow up to become one of his most famous enemies. He plundered the capital's storehouses. He humiliated the court. He made no pretense of respecting Han legitimacy as a constraint on his behavior. He was simply the most powerful man in the room. A coalition of eastern governors and nobles rose against Dong Zhuo in 190 AD. On paper, the coalition was enormous, 18 regional lords, it was said, united under the nominal command of Yuan Shao, the head of the prestigious Yuan family. In practice, the coalition was nearly useless. Its members had their own interests, their own rivalries, their own assessments of the military risks. They advanced, fought some skirmishes, debated their strategy, and largely failed to coordinate. Dong Zhuo recognized that the coalition could not act as a single military force. He withdrew to Chang'an in the west. Before he left Luoyang, he ordered the city burned. Luoyang had been the Eastern Han capital for nearly 2 centuries. It was one of the great cities of the ancient world, home to perhaps 1 million people at its peak, the seat of the imperial ancestral tombs, the imperial libraries, the bureaucratic archives of 400 years of Han administration. The burning of Luoyang by Dong Zhuo in 190 AD was not the accidental destruction of war. It was deliberate. He stripped the city of everything portable and then set fire to what remained. The palaces burned for days. The tombs were looted. The population was force-marched west toward Chang'an. Contemporary accounts describe a 200-mile column of refugees stretching across the central plains. The coalition that had formed to stop Dong Zhuo, having failed to save Luoyang, disintegrated into competing camps. Yuan Shao seized the north. Cao Cao, who had been one of the coalition's more active military commanders, withdrew to his own base in Shandong and began to build his power independently. Liu Biao controlled Jing province in the center. Sun Jian, a brutal and effective general who had actually pushed into Luoyang during Dong Zhuo's withdrawal, was killed not long after. His son Sun Si, and then his younger son Sun Quan would carry on his project in the southeast. Dong Zhuo himself lasted only 2 years after seizing the capital. In 192 AD, he was assassinated by his own general Lu Bu, a man of extraordinary martial reputation and conspicuously unstable loyalties, in a conspiracy organized by the minister Wang Yun. The assassination did not restore order. Dong Zhuo's former generals, unwilling to submit to Wang Yun's authority, marched on Chang'an and took it. Wang Yun was killed. The Han emperor was now a hostage of second-tier military men who had no coherent political project except to keep him in custody. For 4 years, Emperor Xian was passed between warlord camps. He was sometimes sheltered in decent circumstances. He was sometimes fed by scavenging. The imperial court that still nominally surrounded him was a collection of scholars and officials governing nothing, maintaining rituals for an empire that existed only on paper, continuing to issue edicts that no one outside the court needed to obey. In 196 AD, Cao Cao moved the emperor to Zhou. The move was framed as a rescue, and in material terms it was one. The emperor was housed properly, fed regularly, treated with ceremony. But Cao Cao was not motivated by loyalty to the Han in any uncomplicated sense. He understood with remarkable precision the political value of the imperial person. An emperor is a source of legal legitimacy. Any appointment, any title, any order issued in the emperor's name carries the weight of that legitimacy, however theoretical. Cao Cao could give titles to allies and death warrants to enemies and frame both as imperial acts. The emperor was the most powerful political tool the late Han world contained, and Cao Cao intended to use him. For the next 24 years, Cao Cao governed northern China as the emperor's chancellor, fighting campaigns in the emperor's name, awarding titles by imperial decree, and constructing what was in practice an entirely independent state within the formal shell of Han legitimacy. He was genuinely effective as an administrator. He reduced taxes on war-torn northern territories to encourage resettlement. He instituted military agricultural colonies, Tunshan, in which soldiers farmed government land during peacetime, reducing the army's dependence on civilian supply chains. He promoted officials by ability rather than family connection, a policy he enforced with enough consistency that it reshaped the northern governing class. He was also ruthless when ruthlessness was called for. He executed rivals with efficiency. He suppressed opposition with sufficient violence to deter further opposition. His greatest military challenge was Yuan Shao. The Yuan family was the most prestigious in northern China, a family that had held the post of Grand Tutor in 4 successive generations and commanded enormous inherited social capital. Yuan Shao had the largest army, the most territory, and the most prestigious lineage of any northern warlord. By conventional analysis, he should have dominated the north. At the Battle of Guandu in 200 AD, his army outnumbered Cao Cao's significantly. What happened at Guandu is a case study in the gap between conventional military advantage and actual operational effectiveness. Cao Cao, whose supply situation was precarious, learned from a defector that Yuan Shao's enormous supply depot was lightly guarded. He led a night cavalry raid, burned the depot, and destroyed Yuan Shao's ability to sustain a prolonged campaign. The battle turned. Yuan Shao's army, its supply lines severed, disintegrated. Yuan Shao retreated north and died shortly after, his vast coalition fragmenting among his sons. By 207 AD, Cao Cao had eliminated the last of them. The north was his. He turned south toward the Yangtze, toward the remaining warlords Liu Biao in Jing province, Sun Quan in the southeast, and the itinerant general Liu Bei, who had been riding the currents of the civil war for years without ever quite finding solid ground. Liu Bei deserves a moment. He claimed descent from the Han imperial family, a claim that was credible enough to take seriously and unverifiable enough to serve as a useful piece of rhetoric. He was not a sophisticated strategist, and he was not an unusually effective general, at least in the first 2 decades of his military career. What Liu Bei possessed was something harder to quantify, a political persona that attracted capable people to his service. Strategist Zhu Liang, who became Liu Bei's chief advisor after their famous 3 visits seen at his farmhouse retreat, was one of the most analytically gifted minds of the era. The general Guan Yu, whose later deification as the god of war reflects his extraordinary reputation for martial loyalty, served Liu Bei with a personal devotion that the civil war's shifting allegiances rarely produced. Liu Bei's organization was real, and it was committed, even when it had very little territory. In the autumn of 208 AD, Cao Cao's combined force troops from the north, ships built on the Han River, an army that probably numbered in the hundreds of thousands, moved down the Yangtze Valley toward the southeast. Liu Bei and Sun Quan formed an alliance of necessity. Sun Quan's Admiral Zhu Yu planned the engagement. At a place on the Yangtze called Red Cliffs, the Allied fleet met Cao Cao's naval forces. The exact sequence of events at Red Cliffs is disputed. The key accounts are Chinese sources written decades and centuries after the battle, and they do not fully agree. What seems clear is that Cao Cao's fleet was set on fire, either through a deliberate fireship attack launched by the Allied force or through an accidental fire that spread in the packed anchorage. Cao Cao's ships, linked together against instability in the river current, burned rapidly. His army, already weakened by an epidemic, possibly typhoid, possibly something else, could not recover. He withdrew north overland, fighting through marshes, and returned to the Yellow River basin. He would never again attempt a southern campaign of this scale. Red Cliffs did not end the Civil War, but it fixed its geography. The Yangtze River became the approximate boundary between the north and the south. Cao Cao controlled everything north of it. Sun Quan's Wu controlled the delta and the southeast. Liu Bei eventually secured the Sichuan Basin, a naturally fortified territory ringed by mountains, far from the main theaters of war, and declared himself emperor of the Han there. The three-kingdom equilibrium was structural, not accidental. No single power was strong enough to eliminate the other two. For the next 12 years after Red Cliffs, Cao Cao continued to govern the north efficiently while accepting the reality that unification was not coming in his lifetime. He received titles that moved progressively closer to the imperial in everything but name: Duke of Wei, King of Wei. In 213 AD, the King of Wei's territory was formally designated as a kingdom within the Han, with its own bureaucracy, its own nobility, its own succession. The Han emperor in Zhou was still there, still performing rituals, still issuing documents. But the Han state had become a formality maintained inside another state, a nesting doll of fictions. each one more transparent than the last. When Cao Cao died in 220 AD, his son Cao Pi was already the master of an apparatus that functioned without reference to Han legitimacy in any practical sense. The rituals of succession, the formal documents of abdication, the careful staging of the transfer of the mandate, these were performed to satisfy the Confucian moral framework that required proper procedure, not because anyone believed the Han Emperor's continued presence on the throne had any practical significance. Emperor Xian read his abdication edict. He handed over the seal. He became the Duke of Shenyang. 14 years later, he died peacefully. He was buried with imperial honors. The three kingdoms that followed the Han were not simply a period of warfare. They were a period of institutional reconstruction, in which three successor states each tried to claim the Han's legacy and rebuild something of its governing capacity in their respective territories. Cao Pi's Wei used the Confucian bureaucratic tradition and the examination system. Liu Bei's Shu Han explicitly invoked Han legitimacy, staffed its administration with capable advisors, and attempted to reconstruct the ideals of the Han state in miniature. Sun Quan's Wu was the most regionally rooted, a synthesis of the Han administrative model with the practical reality of a coastal, river delta, commercially oriented society. None of them fully succeeded in restoring what the Han had been. The great landowning families, whose power had grown throughout the Eastern Han, and whose influence in the three kingdoms was even greater, since the competing states had to bid for their cooperation, were too powerful. The nine-rank system that Cao Wei formalized to classify officials for appointment effectively institutionalized the very hereditary aristocratic power that the Han examination system had been designed to circumvent. The merit principle was not dead, but it was compromised in ways the Eastern Han's worst period had not quite produced. The Jin Dynasty reunified China in 280 AD, 60 years after the Han's formal end, and collapsed again in 316 AD. The period of the 16 kingdoms followed, 90 years of fragmentation in the north, during which no fewer than 16 states rose and fell. The southern dynasties managed a partial continuity in the south. Reunification under the Sui and Tang dynasties did not come until the late 6th and early 7th centuries, nearly 400 years after the Han's end. The Han collapse was not a brief disruption from which China quickly recovered. It was the opening of a long period of fragmentation and reconstruction that lasted, in various forms, for the better part of half a millennium. What does the Han's collapse tell us? It tells us something specific about institutional failure. The Han state was not destroyed by a superior military force. No external enemy dismembered it. The Xiongnu, who had threatened the Western Han's northern frontier, had been managed and eventually dispersed. The Han fell because its own governing structure contained a self-reinforcing trap, a political cycle in which legitimate succession was repeatedly disrupted by regency, and in which the tools used to break each regency created the conditions for the next one. The eunuch-consort cycle was not an accident. It was the logical consequence of a system in which emperors died young and succession produced minorities. The great families who drained the tax base did not intend to destroy the state. They intended to enrich themselves and protect their descendants. The court officials who tolerated the partisan prohibitions did not intend to enable the Yellow Turban Rebellion. They intended to keep their careers. The regional commanders who kept their armies after the rebellion did not intend to produce the three kingdoms. They intended to secure their positions. No individual decision at any single point was obviously catastrophic. The catastrophe was the accumulation, the slow compounding of structural weaknesses, each one tolerable alone, combined into something that could not be fixed without undoing the compromises that had sustained the dynasty for generations. In this, the Han's collapse resembles not a dramatic catastrophe but a long institutional exhaustion. The dynasty that had given China its name did not end with a bang. It ended with an abdication edict read in a quiet ceremony, and a pension, and 14 years of private ancestral rights in a comfortable estate in the country. The 400 years were done. The world it had made would take 4 more centuries to put back together, in a different shape, with different names, but drawing still on the same Confucian texts, the same administrative traditions, the same idea of the mandate of heaven, the idea that good governance was both a moral obligation and the only secure foundation of political legitimacy. The Han was gone, but the Han remained in everything that came after it.